Okay, in this lesson, we are going to be looking at 4.2, which are plant tissue systems. I briefly mentioned it in the previous video, but we're going to go into a lot more detail in this lesson. So if you have a seed, that's usually where a plant starts growing. If you were to put it in some mud, put some water on it, it's going to start growing. And it grows both upwards, right? You're going to see leaves coming out of it, and downwards, which means that you're going to see some roots growing out of it as well. So what allows for these plant systems to grow, both upwards and downwards, is something called meristematic cells. So that is a unique type of cells within plants that allow it to grow both upwards and downwards. And we'll look at this in a lot more detail on not the next lesson, but the lesson after that. But just in general, the meristematic cells are undifferentiated cells. So they're not really specifically meant to do any other function. Those are undifferentiated cells that eventually, when they do undergo cell division, they become specialized cells. So if you look at a plant, the leaf cell is way different from the bark part of a tree compared to a root. Within one specific plant, you have so many different specialized cells, they all originate from meristematic cells. Okay, moving on to our main topic for today, plant tissue systems. There are a few types of plant tissue systems, as I mentioned in the previous lesson. See if you can try and remember it after pausing the video. There are 3 main types, but I'll go through in a lot more detail in this particular lesson as well. So the first type of tissue type that we're going to be looking at is dermal tissues. Then you have vascular. And then there's ground tissue. So between these 3, you can account for all of the tissue types in a plant. So dermal refers to the types of tissue that you found on the outside of a plant. So outer surface of a particular plant, most of the time, is dermal tissue. Vascular referred to tissue that helps with transport all throughout the plant. And the ground tissue accounts for pretty much every other type of tissue other than the dermal or the vascular. So looking into a little bit more detail of the dermal tissue, they can be separated into 2 further types of tissue. And this can account for 2 different types of plants that we see all around us. So one are woody plants and non-woody plants. So the first type of dermal tissue that we might see is epidermal tissue, or epiderm. And then we have the periderm as well. So the epiderm is the type of tissue that you will find on the outside of non-woody plants. So if you have a house plant and if you don't see any bark on it, then you know that the outside of that plant is epiderm. But if you go outside and you take a look at a tree, that bark part of that outside is periderm. So woody parts of trees. Now moving on to vascular tissue, there are a few things that plants need to do on a daily basis. That's my attempt at a leaf coming out of that tree. So there's the top part, the shoot system, and then at the bottom we've got our root system as well. So one thing that the plants have to do, or most plants have to do, is that they have to absorb nutrients and water from the ground. And that usually happens because of the roots. So the roots absorb water and other nutrients from the soil. And then what they have to do is that they have to pass it along or transport it to the top part of the plant, to the shoot system. So that's one thing that the plant has to do. Another thing that the plant has to do is, one, do photosynthesis, right? So take sunlight, carbon dioxide, water, and turn it into sugar or glucose. And then it has to transport that to different parts of that plant. I'm going to draw that arrow one more time. So as that plants photosynthesize, it's creating energy, and that energy has to be distributed all throughout the plant, right? In order for that plant to do other things as well. So these two things that the plant has to do is done by the vascular tissue. So the two types of vascular tissue are xylem, it's a fun word to say, and phloem. So the xylem accounts for any movement of water and minerals up the plant, so from the roots to the shoot system. I'm just going to write that down. So transport of water and minerals to the shoot system. So the xylem moves from the ground up. And one thing to note about the xylem is that it's made up of non-living cells, or no longer living cells. And like I mentioned earlier, the phloem transports sugars produced by photosynthesis, as well as other chemicals as well throughout the plant. I'm just going to be moving this around. And unlike the xylem, the phloem cells, or the phloem tissue, is made up of living cells. So every part of that is living. So it transports sugar produced through photosynthesis, it transports nutrients, and it transports hormones as well. And that is pretty much it for the xylem and the phloem. And then we have ground tissue. So everything else that I haven't mentioned in this particular tissues, or in the dermal or the vascular, so I haven't mentioned leaves or any other part of the plant, all of that falls under ground tissue. So any other part of the tissue is ground. That can be used for storage, or for chemical storage, or several other tasks as well. But pretty much anything that's not dermal or vascular is ground tissue. And that is pretty much it for our lesson. For homework on page 133, you are doing questions 2 and 3. Yep, that's it. Okay, bye.